Okay, we're going to talk about how I write a perpendicular line after I have found the slope. So the first thing you got to do is, if they want it to be perpendicular, remember you have to think KFC. So am I going to keep or flip and change? So for perpendicular, we want to flip and change the slope. So I'm going to write it here so you can see it. FC, flip and change. So I've got to find the slope from my equation that I was given. So I'm going to have 3y equals -9, and I'm going to subtract 4x from both sides, and now I have to divide by 3 all the way across so that I can find my slope. So I'm going to get y equals 9 divided by 3 is 3, so it's going to be -3, and then 4/3. 4 is not going to divide by 3 evenly, so it's going to stay a -4/3 x. So now I want my slope, because again, I've got to know, am I going to keep the same slope or do I need to flip change it? And because it tells me perpendicular, I know I have to flip my fraction. So that's going to make it 3/4 and change my sign. So it's going to go from negative to positive. So in my final answer, my slope is going to be 3/4. So I'm going to start writing my final equation over here. And remember, it's got to be in y equals mx plus b. So I'm going to say y equals 3/4 x. And then I just need to figure out what is going to be my y-intercept here. And I will not use the same y-intercept, so I'm going to solve for a new y-intercept, just like we did for parallel lines. So we're going to take a y equals mx plus b equation. We are going to plug in an output value. So I'm going to ask myself, where can I get an output value from? And you should see that they gave you an ordered pair. So we're going to take the output value, which is 1, and we're going to plug it in for y. We're going to plug in our final answer for slope, so we are going to use the positive 3/4. We are going to plug that where the m goes in y equals mx plus b, because that's our slope. And then now I need an input value for x. So the input value is going to come from my ordered pair, so I'm going to plug in -4. And so now I'm going to write 1 equals, now I'm going to perform the math. So I need to know what is 3/4 times -4. So I'm going to type in 3/4 times a -4. And I got -3. So I'm going to say -3 plus b. Now I got to decide, am I going to add or subtract 3 to both sides? And hopefully you said add 3 to both sides. So I'm going to say 4 equals the y-intercept. So I know if I was graphing this equation that I would be starting at 0, 4. And then I would be moving up 3, right 4, according to my final slope. And that would make these two graph lines perpendicular. So my final equation is going to be y equals 3/4 x plus 4. But I'm going to use my calculator to check my work. So I'm going to go to y equals, actually I'm going to clear my memory first. I'm going to go to y equals, and I'm going to type in both equations. I'm going to type in the one I rearranged and the equation that I came up with. So I'm going to say -3 minus 4/3 x. And then I'm going to say 3/4 x plus 4. And I want them to be perpendicular. So I'm going to hit graph. And I'm going to see that my lines cross. Now, if they're perpendicular, remember they have to cross at a right angle. And the way that your calculator is set up, it is on a setting for a rectangular window. And you cannot verify perpendicular lines in a rectangular window. So what we have to do is we have to change our setting to a square window. So we're going to go zoom 5 to make it square. Now, I still cannot just look at those graph lines and say, oh yeah, they're perpendicular. I know it now because I'm in a square window. What you have to do is you're going to use a piece of scratch paper, and you will always have scratch paper available on any quiz or test, and you are going to use your corner, because that is a 90-degree angle. You're going to use that as a measurement tool to measure your right angle. And either those lines are perpendicular or they are not. But you have to be in the square window to check this with the corner of your paper. And if you can see, your graph line traces right along the edge of that corner of the paper. So I have confirmed that my slope of 3/4 does make these two lines perpendicular. Now we're going to write this on our paper. So zoom 5. You have to be in the zoom 5 square setting to check for your slope. So I know that my slope is correct. I want to check to see if the math I did on my y-intercept is correct. So here's where I go. I go back to y equals, and I'm going to erase the other equation. I want my final answer equation to be the only equation in y equals. And now I'm going to use my point to check that my y-intercept is correct. So I'm going to go to second graph, and I want to check that -4, 1 shows up in my table of values. So I have an input value of -4, and my output value should be 1, and it is in that table, which tells me the math that I did for my y-intercept is correct, and my equation of 3/4 x plus 4 is the equation that is perpendicular to this line and passes through the point they gave me. So I know that my final answer is completely correct. All right, let's do the next one. We're going to speed it up a little bit. So again, I've got to get my slope. 2y equals 10 plus 5x, because I have to add 5x to both sides, and I'm going to divide by 2. I am looking for my slope. 5 does not divide by 2 evenly, so it's going to stay 5 halves x, and I need my slope. And now I've just got to decide, am I going to K, F, or C? Well, if it's perpendicular, you are going to FC, flip the fraction, and change the sign. So if I flip that fraction, it's going to become 2/5, and if I change the sign, it's going to go from positive to negative. So I know that my final slope in my final answer is going to be y equals -2/5 x. I just don't know what my y-intercept is going to be right at this moment. So how do I find my y-intercept for my final answer? We're going to have to plug in to y equals mx plus b and solve for our y-intercept just like we did on the previous example. So I need an output value, and you go to your ordered pair to get that output value. And our output value for this ordered pair is -1. I'm going to plug in my final answer for slope, so -2/5, because I need a slope value. Do not use the original. And then now I need an input value, an x value, and I go back to my ordered pair. There's my input value, it's 5. And now I'm going to do the math to solve for my y-intercept. So I'm going to say -1 equals, and when I multiply, if I need to get back to my home screen, I can simply second mode. I'm going to type in -2/5 times 5, and I get -2 because I was checking my mental math, plus b, and now I've got to decide add or subtract 2. And I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and my y-intercept is going to be, when I add 2 to -1, I get a +1, so I know if I was graphing this line, I would be starting at the y-intercept at 1, and I would be moving down to right 5. So my final answer is y equals -2/5 x minus 1. But now we're going to use our calculator to check our answer, so I'm going to clear my memory. 2 plus 7, 1, 2. I'm going to go to y equals, and I'm going to type in both equations. 5 plus 5 halves x, and I'm going to type in -2/5 x minus 1, and I'm going to hit graph. And remember, you have to be in that Zoom 5 window setting to check for perpendicular. Zoom 5. And they are either going to be perpendicular in this window or they are not, but you cannot use the corner of your paper until you are in the Zoom 5 window setting. So I want to check, did I solve correctly for my slope, and did I flip change it correctly? I'm going to use the corner of my paper, and I'm hoping they are perpendicular. That means I messed up my slope, and you can see that they are perpendicular. That does follow the corner of my paper, so my slope for my final answer is correct. Now I'm going to go back to y equals, and I'm going to erase out the original equation. I'm going to leave in my final answer, and I want to check that this -1 is the correct y-intercept. So now I'm going to look to see, is the ordered pair for this graph line showing up in the table? And now I've got to go down to 5, and I should see -1. And I do not. What did we mess up on? Oh, this is supposed to be a +1. Okay, let's fix that. See? I showed you how to see if you had a mistake. So let's make sure, let's change this to a +1. And now I'm going to verify that that point is in my table. So see, if you run into a y-intercept that's wrong, you're not going to see that ordered pair in there. So I'm kind of glad I made this mistake so you could see what it looks like. And now I have the correct y-intercept in my final answer because I see my ordered pair in the table. And now I know I have completely done the math right. just like Miss Love did, make sure you're copying down the correct answer in your final answer so that you don't miss that question. And now I've confirmed that my slope and my y-intercept does make these two graph lines perpendicular, and it does have the point that it needs to have. All right, let's look at the last two really quick. So we've got to write the equation of a line that passes through 6, 5 and is perpendicular to the x-axis. Okay, so here's our x-axis. And that is a special line. It's a Hoy line. So I need to think, what line is going to be perpendicular to a horizontal line? A vertical line. So my final answer is going to be a Vux line. So I need to think about, if it's a Vux line, what does that tell me? The V tells me my graph has to be up and down, vertical. The U is trying to remind me that my slope of any vertical line is undefined. And the X is trying to clue me into that my equation is X equals the input value. I just need to figure out, are they asking me about the graph, the slope, or the equation? And they want the equation, so I know that my final answer is going to be X equals an input value. I just need to find an input value. And they gave me an input value in my ordered pair. The input value is 6. So my final answer is X equals 6. But I'm going to graph this to check my work. So here's how you take your equation and you make your graph line. You go to this axis, the x-axis, at 6, and make a point. And then you know how your line is supposed to be graphed because you know it's vertical. So you trace the grid line you need to make it vertical. And now we can use the paper to verify that the x-axis and my graph line are indeed perpendicular. They do meet at a right 90-degree angle. So I have checked that they are perpendicular. And now I want to check that this point, 6, 5, if I go right 6 and up 5, that point is also on my graph line. So I have drawn a line that is perpendicular to the x-axis and passes through the point that it needs to pass through. X equals 6 is my final answer. All right, next. Now we want to write an equation of a line that passes through 4, negative 3 and is perpendicular to the y-axis. So here's my y-axis. And if it's a vertical line, a horizontal line is going to be perpendicular to a vertical line. So I know my final answer has to be a Hoy. So now I'm going to go through that. If it's H, I know that my graph has to be horizontal. So H tells me what the graph looks like. The O is trying to remind me that the slope is 0. Okay, so the middle letter tells you slope. The third letter, Y, tells you how to write the equation. Y equals the output. I just need to figure out, do they want the graph, the slope, or the equation? And again, they're asking us to write the equation, so I know how my final answer is written. I'm going to follow Y equals, and now I need an output value, and you go to the ordered pair to get your output value. It is going to be negative 3. And we're going to check our equation by graphing this by hand. So we are going to go to the y-axis at negative 3. And because I know it's horizontal, I know what the graph line should look like. So I'm going to trace the grid line that makes a horizontal line through negative 3. And now I'm going to use the corner of my paper to check that the y-axis and my graph line are perpendicular. They do meet at 90 degrees. Check. So I know they're perpendicular. I'm on the right track. And now I need to check that my point for negative 3 shows up on my graph line. And it does. So I know that I have the correct Hoy horizontal line equation. Y equals negative 3.